Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics. Today, Kerry and I are joined by Theo Davies-Lewis to discuss his new Spectator article following his recent interview with First Minister Mark Drakeford. Hello, Theo.
Matt. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure as always, mate. Like I said, you've recently conducted this interview with Mark Drakeford. Before we go into the interview per se, can you talk a little bit about how impressive you think the Labour victory was in the recent Senate election?
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to forget, isn't it? Because we've had, 6 weeks or whatever's gone by since the election result. I think everyone's had their analysis. And people forget, obviously, what really has happened over the last 6 weeks or what happened in that election, which was quite historic, really. And I think lots of commentators like me probably thought the Welsh Labour Party were going to be the largest party, but probably didn't expect them to gain a seat. Didn't expect Plaid Cymru to do as badly as they did in that sense. But the Welsh Labour election victory, I think, has certainly surprised, especially Conservatives, that I've spoken to. And it is very impressive. And if you look at the Wales Governance Centre analysis of it and, the Welsh election study, it shows that it was an election won by Mark Drakeford. It was won by Welsh Labour. Obviously, going to italicize, put that in bold, the Welsh bit, which people obviously still resonate with. They still resonate with what the message of the party is. So remarkable election victory for them. 22 years goes on. Next year will be a century of Labour dominance in Wales. I mean, that's completely unparalleled, not only here in Britain, obviously, but around Europe as well.
But do you think, Theo, while it was a Labour victory in Wales, it was a kind of incumbent government victory from all the nations of the UK? Those that were managing COVID in whatever elections they were holding at the time tended to do well. The SNP in Scotland and in the local elections in England, we saw the Conservatives do well. Would it be fair to say it was an incumbent victory?
I think so. But then again, you go back to what Mark Drakeford actually told me, was that incumbency doesn't necessarily deliver victory. I mean, he gave the example of Donald Trump, which isn't actually in the interview, but in the transcript, looking back over it, incumbency doesn't always favour you if you don't do things right. And I think that's the mantra of looking at what's happened across, those governments, across Scotland, England and Wales. Generally, they're probably looked upon favourably in their own populations than we would perhaps look at Boris Johnson here in Wales. He's very popular, especially because of the vaccine rollout. And this idea that Mark Drakeford has kept Wales safe, even though the figures across the UK generally are pretty poor compared to some of the countries our size across the world. But that idea, they kept Wales safe throughout the pandemic, they're still talking about it now. And I think the communitarian approach is certainly much more favourable than what we've seen. It's a slight difference, really, with what's happening in Westminster. But again, like you say, it is an incumbent government. That's one. And obviously there was that, I wouldn't say huge controversy, because I don't think we ever get really huge controversies in Welsh politics, but there was that slight annoyance and frustration from the Conservatives and Plaid Cymru that Mark Drakeford is using his briefings like a dictatorial master, talking to the Welsh nation a week before or a few days before polling day. And at the end of the day, clearly people knew who Mark Drakeford was, and that made a massive difference because they liked him. So, I think you're spot on there, Kerry.
So coronavirus had a bit to play with your interview as well, obviously, because you met with Mark just before he had this summit with Boris Johnson and Nicola Sturgeon and Arlene Foster and Michelle O'Neill. Talk to us a little bit about the circumstances of the interview and how it all came about.
Well, yeah, it was just after. I mean, I think it was like an hour or two after the COVID summit. But and obviously, the First Minister does a lot of interviews. Essentially, he speaks to Welsh media all the time, just press conferences. But I think they wanted to do, the team there, Welsh Government, Welsh Labour Party, wanted to do an interview, I think, with a publication which they think is read by those in London, read by those in power. So I think it was, the conversations were obviously going on for a couple of weeks about it. More just the logistics, to be honest, because it was very hard to find time. My diary is obviously very clear, but the First Minister's isn't. It was going on for a few weeks and then obviously settled perfectly on this date just after the COVID summit. And I think really for him now, the First Minister's got, 2-3 years. It's one thing we'll talk about, obviously, his legacy, but he's got 2 or 3 years left before he retires. And that isn't a lot of time to communicate what you want to do, to get things done, to deliver. And I think he realizes that. And the impression I get from people I speak to is that there is so much confidence from the First Minister. And when I met him, he's very, very confident, which you don't always get from politicians. You know, there's an aura from him as a politician, which obviously you don't see on the surface, so to speak, in terms of he doesn't come across like a dominant political figure, just physically. But it's just the way he was speaking, you know, how a very calculated politician. It was clear that after that election victory, 6 weeks afterwards, or 4 or 5 weeks afterwards, you know, he had this buoyancy that he wanted to go out and speak to somebody like me, who will obviously ask, you know, difficult questions, awkward questions for him, but have absolutely no fear at all when he's asked them. He's very, very good at answering questions like a politician. And I've interviewed quite a lot of politicians in my very, very brief career. And I think he's the most difficult I've ever had to interview, actually, because he doesn't, you know, I try and catch him out on some questions, not in a gotcha kind of way, but I'm kind of looking for a very sort of probing, robust response. And I kind of get halfway there. And I mean, it sort of sums up the history of Wales, isn't it? Where it's one leg in, one leg out. It's not like committed totally. So, and when I interviewed him 2 years ago, it was in Oxford, and nobody knew who he was. You know, I can't confess that I knew everything about Mark Drakeford back then in the summer of 2019. And I sort of joked with him, you know, beforehand when I handed over some dahlia tubers from my mother's market garden, which I'm very happy to admit that my mother is a super fan of Mark Drakeford. So she said she wouldn't take me to the train station unless I brought those dahlias with me. So, you know, I did say to him, I bet the FT didn't turn up with this. So, you know, 2 years ago is a long time. 6 weeks is a long time in politics. You know, a week is a long time in politics. But yeah, you know, this interview, how it came about, glad that he did it, because I think this is what we need more of politicians, is to actually get someone who's an interviewer who's willing to listen and to let them articulate it, but also cut across them when, you know, they need to be challenged as well.
I mean, we talked about this yesterday when we had a quick chat about how he chooses every word. So
a quick chat, man. It was about an hour long. We could have just recorded that. I'm just repeating my lines from yesterday to you.
But no, he's very good at that, isn't he? He picks every word so carefully, but he makes it come across as if it's completely natural. I think that's probably the best political interviewees are like that. Talking about the interview, in that you talk about the plan he has for a national conversation about the Constitution. In the past, again, not only yesterday, but in our previous episodes with you, Theo, we've talked about how Labour tried to play both its nationalist and its unionist wings at the same time. How successfully do you think they'll be able to do that in the future?
Well, right now, they're doing it very successfully, because I think if you look at the data, they've obviously got, you know, a decent number of members and voters that support independence, and Welsh independence is still, you know, it's a mainstream political issue now, but I don't think it's on the minds of everyone, you know, around the country. But it's there. It's not abnormal to talk about it, and that's quite a big step. They've successfully done that in this election. Again, though, it wasn't a major issue, but I think, as I say in the interview, not just on the general constitutional point, where do they stand? It's more, how do they react to events? I think it's going to be really, really difficult for them, actually, in the next 12 to 18 months. I don't think it's going to threaten their power at all. I think Welsh Labour, I think I wrote a piece for The National just after they won, and that essentially said that Welsh Labour, I really don't see how they lose power for a very, very long time, because there's just no opposition for them. But this issue of the Constitution, it does threaten to really destabilise the party, I think, especially depending on what happens in Scotland. I don't think, you know, the likes of Labour for Indie Wales, you know, obviously have good campaigners internally. And they certainly, you know, alongside Plaid Cymru, the other pressure group we haven't mentioned, they've certainly influenced Labour direction on things like second homes, which half of Labour members are probably too frightened to talk about for years, because of the sort of insinuations of what that comes across as. But then they are going to have factions. They still have factions within their own party. I mean, Hiraeth is arguably a part of that as well, is driving this conversation to take a more proactive view on the Constitution. I think the big issue is for them is what happens in Scotland. What is Drakeford's position after Scotland possibly leaves? Even when Scotland has a referendum, are we going to sit on our hands during this referendum like we did in 2014? I think the answer is probably yes. But I think then obviously you'll have a conversation about, okay, what does Wales do next? And I think it doesn't threaten their power base. But again, it's just that question, what will what will Labour's role be in the future of Wales? They've navigated it on so many occasions, and I think that will be the most challenging issue for Welsh Labour, is if we're asked the question independence, will their British-oriented members be prepared to argue for Welsh independence in whatever way? I mean, I don't think I'm actually sure about that.
One you mentioned there, and you mentioned in the article about the Internal Market Act, Theo, and the Welsh Government have got legal proceedings from April, and also touch upon the Shared Prosperity Fund. How do you think these are going to impact upon the union?
Well, I mean, it's already impacting on it in the sense that the strains between Cardiff and London, and for people I speak to, both in obviously Cardiff and in London, in Whitehall, in SW1, I've never seen such poor relations, and maybe on a symbolic, a macro political level, because obviously collaboration happens all the time on certain things, but on those issues, I've never seen such poor relations I'm 23, so I haven't got the arc of history like you have, Kerry, but I obviously look at it from the likes of Vaughan Gething, who says, it's undermining devolution, Drakeford says in this interview. And again, to go back to Matt's point on the consistent messaging, for days afterwards, he was saying the line, stealing powers and stealing money from the Senedd because of the impact of the Shared Prosperity Fund, the Levelling Up Fund, all these they're all kind of the same thing. That is really not just frustrating the Welsh government, but the Scottish government, because they very factually correct. They are frustrated that they don't have the same powers as they had pre-Brexit, and EU regional funding now obviously is controlled differently. Simon Hart says that the UK government in Wales is going to be more active than ever, and the argument, of course, from the Welsh government is well, that's not people voted for 6 weeks ago, and also that's not really contingent on what we've had over the last 2 decades, 2 referendums supporting a Welsh parliament making decisions. So it's straining relationships, and this is what I think the First Minister touches upon in certain language that he says to me in the interview, talking about this muscular unionism, which has tipped over into kind of unilateralism from the Prime Minister down. That's what Cardiff sees happening, and in the consciousness of people, I don't know whether that really has an impact. The unionists in Whitehall say it doesn't, but I think the Welsh government are very, very good in communicating this message very clearly, that stealing powers and stealing money, for that kind of line from Mark Drake does hit you home. The only difficult bit is when they ask him what powers are being stolen. It's obviously a bit more complicated than that. So it's straining the relationship not only with Scotland, which is basically being pushed away from the union as it is, but with the unionist government in Cardiff. And people need to remember that, and I have to emphasise that to you, that people should realise in SW1 that Mark Drakeford is a unionist. And if you read the interview, that'll come through. And I do point to the fact that some people don't think he is, but if you understand anything of Welsh politics, you know that he is a unionist. And just by asking for more powers on things like policing and justice doesn't make you a nationalist. And I think that's what is really, really troubling if you are a unionist, and if your head's screwed on properly, that this is really inflaming the tensions between Cardiff, Edinburgh, London. Belfast, obviously, a completely different issue, which is probably even more dangerous, actually, not just for society in Northern Ireland, but just for the union as well. So I do wonder how the actions and the rhetoric from the likes that push the Internal Market Act, the Shared Prosperity Fund, how it joins up with their rhetoric on how they don't want to make the union a binary choice between unionists and nationalists, because that's exactly what it does, Kerry, and it spells only trouble, I think, for the union in the next few years.
We're talking about unionism there, between Mark Drakeford's unionism and the unionism of Boris Johnson. Where do you fundamentally see the differences between how they view the union?
I think there's 2 things. First of all, in terms of how they want to save the union, if we talk about it in that sense, in terms of saving the union, because the union is in crisis. I think people generally acknowledge that, or we're heading into a crisis. They both want to save the union. That's the first point. So they're not too dissimilar there. What the First Minister has said over the last few weeks is the fact they've got a different recipe. And Mark Drakeford's unionism is, kind of giving home rule for Wales, radical federalism, which we'll talk about. And then Boris Johnson is, they might not say it, but it's about centralising power, and that isn't necessarily where everyone is, I don't think, across Wales and Scotland. I don't think that's what the Celtic nations want to see. But in terms of how they define the union, it's a very interesting question. and you guys will know this anyway, and lots of your listeners will, in terms of the Welsh Labour tradition of unionism. I think it captures where most people across Wales have been historically. That's why they've been so successful. It's been an economic and social partnership. They've genuinely invested in it as an idea. The majority probably supporting a monarchy, key institutions, a redistributive economy, which I think that's a symptom of the Drakeford socialism. I know there's been quite a lot of angst recently. People don't want Drakeford to be viewed as a socialist, but I still kind of see him as a socialist. That kind of idea of the Nye Bevan unionism that, who obviously had a different view of devolution altogether than the First Minister, you could value the redistributive economy. And I think that's the big difference from Boris Johnson. He might implicitly believe it, but I think for Boris and the Conservative Party, lots of them now actually don't necessarily value the union as much as they do other political projects. I mean, I think now, because Brexit's got done, they're coming out of COVID, the union will be in the spotlight again. I think for them, it's difficult to define in terms of the Conservative vision for it now, apart from seeing it as a unitary state. And I think that's a very, very difficult square to circle, essentially, because I think there's no one's definition of the union is wrong, but it's that issue of their idea of the UK as probably, London commanding over different capitals and different parliaments might be in tune with what the public want in England, maybe, but not necessarily elsewhere. So to go back to the crux of your question, you've got two different recipes for solving the problems they have, and they probably value different elements of it. I think the Union Jack kind of symbolism is where the Prime Minister stands, and the First Minister probably, like most people, people like me, and I'm not really fussed by the kind of Union Jack waving, let's all get behind Team GB kind of empty rhetoric kind of unionism. And I think that's a shame, because I think we've conflated different points, to do with Britain and what the UK stands for. I think Wales actually as a claim, obviously, to have that ancient connection with the Britons. The Welsh language is spoken, obviously, in Scotland, Northern England. I mean, that's the kind of romantic Britishness that I still have a feeling towards, to be honest with you, and I think most Welsh people do. But that's the point, is that I think it's not only the two leaders, unionism, Britishness, identity, that are different, but it's actually, I think, different parts of the UK as well value it differently. The English votes for English laws is a great example that inadvertently, that actually is going to have a disastrous effect on English voters, because of the fact that the Scots and the Welsh will be perceived to be interfering and blocking stuff. And obviously, if you look at the opinion polls, the English studies that have been taken, the English people generally resent the fact that the Scots have so much power and have so much undue influence, and that's not going to solve this. So to basically answer the question you haven't asked me yet, Kerry, but two different concepts of unionism there, and everything associated with it. But I got the sense from the interview as well. I couldn't believe how stark it was, and actually how the conviction that comes through. It's not political point scoring. You could have said that a year ago, maybe. You could have said that if you wanted to be skeptical, but it's really not. It's fundamental differences on the union as it stands.
But there's so much in that to unpick, and I think it's best laid out by asking about Drakeford's favourite solution to this problem, which is his radical federalism shtick, right? You mention all these things about the conception by a lot of Conservatives of the UK as a unitary state, the tendency at the moment for UK Conservatives to be a centralising rather than a devolving force. You talk about their habit for using things like evil, piecemeal, ad hoc solutions to problems that require a more sort of holistic solution. Surely these all point to just how difficult it will be for the UK to ever adopt a radical federal model, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I said that to the First Minister. I think it's so undeliverable. It's never going to happen, I don't think, with the Conservative government anyway. And I really don't see how they would implement it. And there's one point in the interview that I say in terms of the reform of the UK, and I ask the First Minister, and he says he wants a radical federal model. He talks about sovereignty, which I hope we can talk about a bit as well, which is really interesting, actually. And it was, for the people I spoke to in the Spectator, actually, they were very struck by his ideas, which is one point to come back to. But on radical federalism, I said to him, how can we do it? And, he was very, very good because he was saying, Scotland has a pretty big card of the referendum to play, Northern Ireland, the knowledge that comes from there, that kind of, creates tension and, leads to action. And in Wales, we have the quality of the argument. And I actually interrupted him and I said, well, that, and I sort of laughed and I said, oh, that's not much, is it? And he was like, well, it ought to be haunted. And I just thought, at that point, my heart dropped, actually, and my jaw dropped in the interview because I was so disappointed in the answer that we had the quality of the argument. And I thought, really, to be honest with you, I thought that's the great tragedy of Wales, the thought that we can change things with creative thought. Radical federalism conceptually as an academic idea to the problems that we have, you'd argue maybe it makes sense, give everyone more autonomy, let them run their own affairs, but maintain it as a UK brand. I'd argue that makes sense. But in terms of the delivery of it, Matt, I just don't know how you do it. And Starmer, does Starmer support radical federalism? I don't think he does. And he's never going to get into government anyway. So, what do you think, guys? I know you guys talk about that. Those are probably the two most mentioned words on this podcast. So, but I just don't know. Have you heard anything from anyone? Like, you guys speak to the Labour folk often. Has anything changed your mind from thinking, it's quite difficult to deliver, or actually there's conversations happening?
I guess, just putting something in a manifesto doesn't make it true, does it?
Yeah, we can say that about every party, can't you?
Exactly. I think that it's definitely will form the basis of the next UK Labour general election manifesto. When we spoke to Stephen Bush, someone with his ear pressed firmly to the ground in UK Labour circles, he seemed to think it would definitely be part of the process, especially considering how much influence someone like Mark Drakeford will wield over the policy-making process when it comes to issues like Wales and the Constitution. He can't see how it wouldn't be part of the manifesto. The bigger question is, how do you turn that manifesto commitment into action when it seems ever harder for the UK Labour Party to form a majority government in Westminster? So I suppose that's what the rub comes down to, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And I think you look at what Gordon Brown's been saying, and I think just to say as well on Gordon Brown, obviously he doesn't have the best record on devolution, but his opinions on where we are in the UK I actually really value them. I think they're really good. I like his articles and so on. He's obviously working on the constitutional review and whatever. But again, to go back to something that probably wasn't discussed in the interview, but we've talked about before, whether it's actually too late for radical federalism. The Scots, would they ever go for that? Maybe they would. I think it'll all come down to the fact that they'll have to have a referendum. I think there's no question. And actually the pressure's on Nicola Sturgeon to do that now, because she's going to have to call it. And most people don't really want it to happen in the pandemic. And this pandemic is prolonging probably until the end of the year. Because I think they were sort of mooting perhaps spring next year for a referendum. But interestingly, the intelligence of Mark Drakeford, the very sort of considered questions that the fantastic interviewer was asking him about Welsh independence. He did say, if there was a Welsh independence referendum, you put independence on the ballot paper, you put staying in the UK as it is, and then you put the case for a reformed UK on the ballot paper. That's never going to happen, but it just shows you where he is. I think he's a unionist, he's a diehard unionist. I think, and again, something we'll chat about in terms of what's that red line, if there is one. But for him, he really does want to wants to make it better. Simon Hart says it's unionism on Mark Drakeford's terms, and the Welsh government isn't Wales, and all these things. But you could say exactly the same about the UK government in Britain. It's very, very difficult, I think, to go back to your original question, very difficult to see how they implement it. Is all this, reforming our union paper and the constitutional conversation we're going to have in the next 5 years, is it all academic? It wasn't back in the One Wales government when we had the consultation on further powers for the Senedd, but that was nowhere near what we're talking about now in terms of complexity. So yeah, we'll have to see.
So you mentioned Gordon Brown, Scotland, and independence. There are comments in this article that you've written that I think are in stark contrast to a lot of the murmurings we've heard from Mark previously. And I think it's why everyone should obviously go and read it when it's out, because when he was with you, he talked about how even if Scotland were to leave, there's a way that it could work, Wales and England as a UK, a United Kingdom of England and Wales. Now, in the past, when he's been asked about Scotland leaving, he said we'd have to consider our options, which everyone, I don't know if it was just me being naive, everyone sort of took to mean that we would have to have a serious conversation about whether we stayed part of the United Kingdom as a United Kingdom of England and Wales. But this, to me, sounds much more like if that were to happen, if Scotland were to leave, he would look to find any way possible to make England and Wales as a United Kingdom work. Is that what you got from his comments?
I think it's difficult because, he did say, it's very uncomfortable for him to think about. But then he did say, as a caveat, well, actually, you could. It's not. I think the words he used was something like, it's not impossible to design a relationship that would work to Wales' advantage. Again, the standing up for Wales, no matter the cost. I mean, even we're going into a union with England. I mean, oh God, honestly. I think it's harder. I think he genuinely meant it when he doesn't. He says, it's very uncomfortable to think about. But again, I think it is that inner reluctance from the First Minister. What is the First Minister's opposite? What's the political ideology that really, sort of repugns him? What does he really find repugnant? What does he not like? And it's probably Toryism. And the other bit is probably nationalism. And I think, whichever one you put in front of the other, it's difficult to be honest. I think he did an interview last year with Nick Robinson on the Political Thinking podcast where he mentioned his upbringing and how he never was attracted to nationalism in that sense. And I think those comments on the UK of England and Wales, which the likes of Gavin Esler have not warned about, they've predicted. I think the First Minister genuinely wouldn't find that comfortable. But I think it shows you a bit more that I don't know whether this was in his thinking or not, because I didn't ask him, but whether the Labour Party in Wales, we say it's pro-devolution, wants further powers. Obviously, it kind of varies as to who wants what. But there is obviously that wing, and certainly the Parliamentary Labour Party in Westminster, thinking of the likes of Chris Bryant, who delights in telling us that Glyndŵr didn't have a parliament in Machynlleth, that see, Wales's distinctiveness, or Wales generally a bit more different to the likes of Mark Drakeford, who I think is much more sympathetic to the cause of Wales. But again, I think you're right in terms of the way you asked that question. I think his unionism actually is much stronger than people have realised. People on social media, actually a bit of insight from social media for once, that I see some of the bile on my social media feed. But some of it, to be fair, for some of the nationalists, is actually quite insightful in terms of they're crying out because everyone loves Mark Drakeford, obviously, and when he's wearing the sort of hat when Wales are playing football and stuff, he's lovely granddad and whatever. He is really committed to the UK state, the British state, and people don't realise that in SW1, and they don't realise that, I think, in some parts of the Labour Party. But again, I think it reflects probably where we are. I think, it's the national story is going to be played out through Mark Drakeford over the next 3 years. And I don't think if you asked at a referendum now to vote with the UK of England and Wales, I don't know what you think. I don't know. I mean, I would vote to leave. I wouldn't want to be the UK of England and Wales. I'm an Anglophile and I live in England and I've got an English girlfriend. I've got to say that very quietly in here. She's going to come in and burst to the door in a second. But, I'm an Anglophile, but I just don't think that's practical. So I don't know how people in Wales would feel about it. I don't think there's ever been polling on it. And maybe I'm wrong. But I think actually we might be a bit surprised because I don't think it'll be as a landslide for Welsh independence as we think. It's genuinely a really interesting one. And I think those were the comments. And actually, speaking to the team that was sort of editing the piece, there's lots in there in the interview that actually didn't make it. I think the piece is about, to bore all of you, it's about 1,800 words. And there's so much more that isn't in there. But what I think people find interesting in London that I speak to that have seen the interview are the comments on the UK of England and Wales, because, and this is really interesting, obviously, they don't understand that it would be a terrifying thing for most people. I'm sorry, I say most people again. I mean, for some people, it would be a terrifying nightmare to have a UK of England and Wales. And the English are kind of like, well, why would it be? Why would it be a nightmare? It'd be lovely to have you as a playground. I mean, what do you mean? People don't get it. And I think that's another interesting thing, just in terms of how we are perceived around the UK, and in particular in England, that a UK of England and Wales, I think the likes of Simon Brooks have talked about us being a playground not only for tourists but for others as well. So yeah, we'll have to see. But again, I'd like to agree with the First Minister, actually, when he says, that's a very uncomfortable thing. But it probably is impossible, I'll disagree with him, that to design a relation in Wales' advantage. I don't think it'll ever work.
How do you think the views the First Minister's expressed would be shared in the wider Labour Party? Where do you think the party as a whole is in this regard? It's
a good question, because I think if you look at the debate around criminal justice and policing, it probably shows you that not everyone in the party will support further devolution, and not even the First Minister in terms of things like welfare. That's a very contentious issue in the party. But again, I think it's probably to show that I think the First Minister actually is probably emblematic of where most of the party is on most issues, actually, because he's certainly to the left of Carwyn Jones. He's probably more in the mould, obviously, as the late Roger Morgan, who obviously they are kind of carbon copies in some ways in terms of their political ideologies. And I think the First Minister does kind of reflect a lot of the party's views, and that's why I think he's such a popular leader, not just because he wins elections, because that certainly helps, but he's a very, very popular leader. The interesting thing, obviously, is who in that top 3 or 4 in the cabinet are with the First Minister in terms of what he thinks. I mean, the likes of Jeremy Miles, Elenion Morgan, and Vaughan Gething, I think they're all different to what the First Minister thinks on some of the big issues, including the Constitution. But I think there's probably never been a Welsh leader with such a hold over their party, and you could sort of compare it in some ways to Sturgeon in the SNP, because there's debates with her, in the sense people don't agree with her independence strategy, the kind of Salmonites who think you should treat it as a different approach, because on the big issues there will always be division. And I mentioned Chris Bryant, he's not going to agree with the First Minister, I don't think, on some of the big constitutional questions and the interpretation of Welsh history and that sort of thing. But I would argue that the First Minister, Mark Drakeford, has a real hold over Welsh Labour, and in a very positive way, because I don't think, I agree with you totally, it's a broad church, and the Mick Anthony kind of discussion of the constitutional future shows that certainly in the Welsh Labour Senedd Party, the Senedd group, they're all on board. It obviously might vary with what's happening in that Westminster group.
You mentioned when you said the comparison with Sturgeon, I actually thought you were going to go with Stalin, which was which would have been interesting. But
yeah.
Taking this a little bit further, one of the interesting lines I saw in the article was that the First Minister suggested that Labour came within a whisker of being the largest party in the UK in 2017. Yeah. And, that's not really the case. Depending on your perspective, you can view Jeremy Corbyn's election in that year. But Labour actually ended up with nearly 60 seats below the Conservatives. So it's not really a whisker. They did lose, and they lost quite convincingly. It was when you add in the other parties that it became very tight in the position. Do you think there's anything we can take from Mark's view that was a successful 2017 election for Labour, and how that might be perceived in the wider party?
Yeah, I think it's quite an easy one. I think it's about policy. If he says that Corbyn had a very attractive policy offer, and he says in the interview, we were a Labour Party that, along the lines of saying, essentially, we were a Labour Party that stood for things and knew what we were standing for, and we weren't saying things like, we're just better than the other lot. We're actually a Labour Party. We want to make this country better. And again, I think on that particular section, and probably to reiterate to your listeners, there's lots in here that many people would have read before. What I find interesting, and the value of these kinds of interviews, is that you get it all in a kind of in one sort of narration, and it's all there, and all these ideas are in one. But the new bits on, you mentioned the UK of England and Wales, Labour is another one, where he essentially, saying that Corbyn was a good leader, and the manifesto in 2017, he said specifically to me, he's very proud to stand on that manifesto. And I think he, as he said to the Mirror as well, Keir Starmer, and didn't say it explicitly, but was saying essentially that, you've got to know what you stand for, you've got to be distinct. And this is what most commentators like me have picked up on, that Welsh Labour knows exactly what it stands for. And that sometimes isn't really a definite position either, which is how brilliant they are. and how the electorate, are not as complex as we all think. It's a very fluid kind of, talk about the Welsh identity of Welsh Labour. Most people probably wouldn't be able to define that anyway, apart from saying clear red water. It's a very fluid kind of, it's just the perception, it's the PR of it as well. And I think Drakeford on that question was more genuinely on the substance, was very clear that he, again, we need to remember, and not everyone agrees with this, but he is certainly on the left wing, certainly I think he's a socialist of the Welsh stripe. I think, if I'm right, I think he and Kevin Brennan described Rhodri Morgan as that in the introduction to the autobiography by Rhodri, which I'm actually rereading, which is very, very good. And I think that's where Mark Drakeford is, socialist of the Welsh tribe, which is very distinct from what British Labour has been, was totally different to what they were during the Blair years with Gordon Brown. Bit different with Miliband. Now, I just don't think anyone knows what Keir Starmer stands for. And I think the First Minister, although he likes the leader of the Labour Party in London, they are two distinct leaders of two distinct parties. And that is the thing that is troubling them. We're speaking a few hours after the by-election where the Liberal Democrats, a Welsh-speaking candidate, by the way, which is brilliant. So obviously I was supporting her in the by-election. And Labour having, I think it was his worst. I think it was Labour's worst by-election result ever. For a certain amount of certain years, and I think that says it all really. In a kind of southern seat, quite affluent, but where they used to do well, historically, obviously they used to win. And this probably captures the identity crisis they're having. But that 2017 kind of section of the interview about Drakeford, it reminds people that he was on Corbyn's side and they were friends, and they both love allotments as well. So, I mean, that's enough to bond any two men together, isn't it?
There's going to be certain people in the Labour Party who are going to read that and see it as a kind of, it was a successful 2017 campaign. That whisker, it wasn't a whisker, and that I know is going to upset certain people in the party, but it's kind of that revisionism of that campaign is going to be portrayed in a successful light when they're probably trying to move away from that. But
it's happening all the time, though, isn't it? Because even like the I love it on social media again when I go and glance on it, when they say, I think it was the line was that, Corbyn actually kept Hartlepool. Why? I was kind of like, oh, come on, guys. It's just there's no rigor in that analysis whatsoever. It's completely different. I think you're right. I was thinking at the time, it was a very strange kind of thing to say, but I think it caught more than anything for me that, I think he really believed in the Corbyn project. And I think it was probably emblematic of a lot of the Corbyn supporters in a bubble where they thought, well, we've got the best ideas. Why are we not winning? And then obviously some of them still think, oh, we were winning. It's just we didn't have enough time. And then obviously the 2019 election is explained away as a Brexit election. And, some of that is true. But I think you're right. I mean, not many, in Wales, fortunately for Mark Drakeford, we've kind of forgotten about the psychodrama of Jeremy Corbyn over the Labour Party, because Mark Drakeford was, kind of a key supporter of that when he had the whip withdrawn, Jeremy Corbyn. It was very kind of difficult for the First Minister to say anything. But fortunate for him, we have moved on from it. So I don't think you'll have any other plucky journalists or commentators, Kerry, asking him about it. But it's a shame, actually, because it's probably one of the most interesting periods in British political history. And our First Minister was really kind of side by side with Corbyn, certainly on the policy stuff anyway.
We'll get into Labour's fascination with glorious defeat on another episode, I'm sure. Yeah, on Drakeford. His legacy, looking forward now, do you think there's any chance that his legacy will be anything but his response to the COVID-19 pandemic?
If I'm honest, no, because I don't think we have enough of a civic society and a media really to kind of sustain another, to tell a story really about Mark Drakeford. I don't think, we have leaders that really leave a massive impression, certainly on policy. Listen, in Wales, there were things that Rhodri Morgan's government did, obviously with Rhodri Morgan dying, a few years ago, there will be things that we would remember Rhodri Morgan for doing, things like, and Welsh Labour for doing, like the prescriptions is one thing I think about, the environmental policy and plastic bags. But really, I don't think we really go in that much depth in the public consciousness with saying as politicians yet. I mean, I think clear red water will be Rhodri Morgan's legacy. Carwyn Jones might obviously have a slightly difficult one because of the events over the last year or so with his leadership, and he studied the ship generally around over like 8 or 9 years. With Mark Drakeford, I think because he was a leader throughout the pandemic, that's what makes great leaders in history. And Anthony Seldon, wrote a fantastic book on the prime ministers and sort of 300 years. And to be a great prime minister, you need to have circumstances, obviously the qualities, right place, the right time. And I obviously wrote for my friends in Hiraeth a few days before the election that Mark Drakeford was the right leader at the right time. And I think that is true. Go back to the fact that obviously the figures in Wales are not as strong as somewhere like New Zealand. But that's it's the other side of the world. It won't be played into Welsh history. I think that's what we will remember him for. Personally, I think that's what we will remember him for. Depending what happens with the union, there might be a chance in the next 3 years that something really kicks off. And if Scotland leaves in the next 3 years, who knows? What Mark Drakeford's position might have to be. Was he going to be campaigning on a referendum question? We might have a referendum in the next 3 years. You just don't know. But I think to go back to the interview, he identifies COVID, sort of fighting COVID as his priority, public health in an economic sense. The Constitution is kind of referenced as it's always going to be there. Climate change is clearly, I don't think he's actually in the interview, but he does say something like, we've got to do our bit, haven't we? Which I think is such a nice Welsh phrase. We've got to do our bit, And the other sort of element of Mark Drakeford's legacy, which is new, and I think it's first come out in this interview actually properly and in an articulate way about that he wants to make Wales, in very generic terms, obviously, wants to make Wales, a place where you can make a future, that people can start their families and not have to leave. And over the weekend, I know Sunday Politics in Wales have a segment really on, the brain drain and graduates leaving. Obviously, that's something that's interesting to me and the work that I do with Darogan, but it's more the fact that that's a new thing that First Minister, could he change anything on the brain drain, making Wales a better place to work? There's certainly a lot to do. I think that's probably much more impactful in terms of the results of seeing something than climate change, because climate change will be a sort of 10, 15-year project, which first I don't think Drakeford will be totally remembered for, and people don't think he's got all the answers either for it. But I do think, to go back to my first point, I think it's going to be very hard for him to be seen as anything other, and it's not a bad thing, by the way, to be seen as anything other than the First Minister that was actually ingrained in the public consciousness, for good or bad. The interesting bit, obviously, for us, and I lament it every day when I have nightmares about Welsh politics, is the fact that wasn't reflected in the Senedd election, in the sense that we didn't have, over 50% turning out, and compare that to the general election in 2019. I think it was 66% in 2019 that turned out to vote in Wales. And I think that probably shows you the disparity of the attention that was given. The legacy that the First Minister might have is very different to, if we look back now, as the legacy of the Senedd. It certainly isn't seen as impactful as the office of the First Minister of Wales, which I think is a great shame.
Do you think there's no temptation in him to try and do something really, not to say the COVID pandemic isn't a tangible success, it obviously is, but to have something added to the Senedd, to get more powers over justice, prisons, policing, probation, more, although he doesn't want them, more welfare powers, to see an increased Senedd, or a Senedd with a different electoral system? It doesn't seem to me like these big constitutional changes are really what he's focused on now.
I agree with that. I don't think he is focused on it, actually. And I say, I think that the headline of the piece hopefully hasn't changed in the meantime I'm speaking to you, because you have to edit this out afterwards. I think I call him King of Fortress Wales. And I actually came up with that, by the way. Normally I don't write the headline, but I actually came up with that, which I'm very proud of. And he says it in a way of, I very, very cheekily turned his words against him, as I always do with everyone, because I think he said he didn't want to create a fortress Wales, which was enclosed in, no one could leave. And I say, well, actually, that's what he's done, because he's built up Wales, he closed the borders, he's trialing different policy, and I think I see him kind of as the head of this new kind of nation now. But I think you're right that he's not focused on the nation building side of things as I thought he would be. The Senedd members issue, I think, is a really, really big one. And I really hope that is the reforms to get more Senedd members are introduced. I'm a very can be very cheeky in my column saying, oh, no one was shouting for £12 million a year more for 30 members or whatever, but we certainly need it. Again, it probably goes back to Kerry's earlier question as to where the Welsh Labour Party sit on it, because obviously it doesn't necessarily mean good things for the Welsh Labour Party, which the First Minister will be thinking about. But again, I have to give him the benefit of the doubt, because lots of in terms of the devolution of powers, that's not necessarily up to him either. And I think, he has been calling for radical federalism. At the manifesto, there was a commitment for the devolution, or I can't remember the language in the manifesto, but it would have been written as something like campaign or urge, because they can't do it themselves. Things like policing and so on, they have to go with the begging bowl to Westminster. And again, it goes back to our original discussion that there are two different recipes for solving the union, and Mark Drakeford's saying give us more power, autonomy, distinctiveness, whereas Westminster says no, because they're very suspicious of that. They don't understand what that means. They don't understand why that would in some ways quash any kind of frustration or bubbling sentiment for soft nationalism or growing nationalism. But I think, to be very critical, I think that answer about the force of argument, and I think that was what I came back to all the time. He said that Scotland had a massive card to play when they kind of cajoling with the UK government. We've always relied on the force of argument, and I just thought I was so disappointed in that answer, because it really kind of summed up for me where we are, and I've been genuinely quite concerned over the last year. I mean, how sad am I? The listeners probably listening, what the hell's wrong? You have a normal life, but it is genuinely really concerning to see that there's such division between London and Cardiff, and then we are absolutely powerless to do anything about it. I mean, keep campaigning, keep putting it to Westminster, but I'll give him the benefit of the doubt if he does properly start calling for stuff for devolution, further devolution. It's not all in his hands, and I think that's a big problem of where we are with the union today.
One really super quick question before we wrap. Who's next? Who do you think his replacement will be? And what sort of Wales do you think he will leave in his stead for them to take over?
I think in terms of the Wales Mark Drakeford leaves, I think it's, first of all, interesting, when is he going to go? I think his 70th birthday is in mid-September. I mean, you must think I'm very strange, but I mean, it's in mid-September, and he wants to go by then. And that doesn't necessarily mean he'll leave by then. He might go a year before. He might go, he might go the next year. We don't know. I think he's gonna leave a Wales which is far more understands the Senedd, or probably understands the First Minister of Wales exists more. I think there's still much more work to be done in terms of public understanding of the Senedd, how it works, local members, how that all works. But there's a definite shift, I think, in terms of the consciousness between where we were literally 12 months ago and where we are now. And I think that's one of the major things. And this goes back to your question about will he be remembered for being the pandemic First Minister, the pandemic Prif Weinidog. And I think then he also leaves Wales, if he gets his way, he'll leave it very firmly on the left, which Wales has been for decades, close to, probably about 150 years, really. I mean, not as Liberals obviously were different to where Welsh Labour are, but still cementing that legacy. And probably then that comes into the next the part of my answer on who he leaves it to, because then I think the next leader, as we've discussed before, Matt, will have to be very similar to the First Minister in terms of where he is on the political spectrum, or where he or she is, I should say, is on the political spectrum, because it could either be, in my view, and I look forward to you pulling this up in a couple of years, it could be Jeremy Miles, it could be Eluned Morgan, it could be Vaughan Gething, and those are the three. There might be, it might be a dark horse in there. I don't think they will, just because of how, I don't think they'll be successful anyway, but just because of, who gets the trade union support, who gets the membership, and how the system works. Those three are probably the most established. I'd stick my neck out and probably say it's going to be Eluned Morgan, actually, because I don't think Vaughan Gething would win. I don't know. I think there's still questions over, where he stands on some of the big issues, whether he's not a Welsh speaker, whether that will influence I don't know. I'm not a member of the Welsh Labour Party, so I couldn't comment on it. But I still think, is he that popular in the country? I don't know, because I know he's walked off a couple of interviews before, and I didn't like that when he did that. So I think there's that kind of perception sometimes, although he's got a huge profile being a health minister. Whether the inquiry into COVID next year will wipe him out if he's done bad things. Jeremy Miles is obviously he's been groomed for a few years to do it. Looks like a leader, quite smart. He's got all those elements to it as well, like Vaughan Gething. I think he's probably the kind of you'd probably put your money on him at the minute, because he kind of is being groomed for it and looks like a leader, whereas Vaughan has been touted for years to do it and went for it last time and didn't win. But then I think, for me, I just think the pressure to get a female leader actually will probably tip over, actually, personally. I know that was the case last time as well. I'd love to see a Wales run by a female leader, because I think it's disastrous that we haven't had one yet. We could say all we want about all female shortlists and the issues that are sparked internally in some parties, but I think having females in sort of positions of leadership is very important, and it's just very strange that we haven't had one, to be honest. I think it's a bit weird, and I think she genuinely has impressed me, to be honest with you. Obviously that's reflected in her promotion in the cabinet. They're all three, they all look the part, they all sound the part, really. It depends who's going to have more targets on their back by the time I think it comes to it, and who's sort of garnering support now. I think the big issue for all three will be where they stand on the big policy issues, the left-wing policy issues, which I don't think none of them I don't think are that close to Mark Drakeford, I don't think, in terms of where he is. But I think the next Labour leader, so my final point on the question, the next Labour leader, I think, Welsh Labour leader, will be the one that has to tackle the biggest issues, I think, on, to go back to the union. They will have to decide. I mean, Vaughan Gething this week actually has been coming out very strongly on the bills and shared prosperity fund stuff. So maybe he's being groomed by Drakeford. This is the copy of how you speak to Westminster. Maybe he's given him his notes. But I think they will be the ones that will have to navigate Wales's place in the UK. If things go south, further north in Britain, I think that next Welsh Labour leader, he or she, will have to decide the future of Wales and where Welsh Labour sits within it. And right now, if you asked all three, I think you get three very different answers, actually, about where they would take Wales if Scotland voted to leave or there was a referendum question. Because, to be honest with you, I don't think they've even thought about it. So this is the really interesting thing. So I put my money on Lyned Morgan, but I think the other two, Jeremy and Vaughan, obviously they're very strong ministers in their own right. They're political operators, but I think the stars, from what I hear, I think the stars are aligning for Lyned Morgan. So we'll have to see if I'm embarrassed in 2 years when I come back again.
Well, Theo, thank you as always for coming to talk to us. If people want to hear more from you, where can they find you on Twitter?
At Theo Davies-Lewis. So please do send me any abuse or compliments, which is very rare, actually. So if you'd like to do that, I'd be very pleased. And where's your article going to be tomorrow? Today, whenever it is. I mean, I don't know when. It's on the Spectator website, which I hope you all read. Obviously, there's lots in there that didn't get in there, which is a shame. So if there's any Welsh Government advisors, please don't tell me off. But I've done my best to reflect everything. And thank you, obviously, to you guys at Hiraeth as well. It's been a real pleasure. And also, I will be on Sunday Supplement to talk about this as well after the First Minister comes on. So it's going to be a massive shouting match. So do tune in. It's going to be I'm just going to basically say all the same things again. So please do tune in for that.
Well, as I said, Theo, pleasure as always. And if you've enjoyed what you've heard today on Hiraeth, please don't forget to find us on Medium at Hiraeth Blog Cymru, on Facebook at Hiraeth Blog Cymru, and on Twitter at Hiraeth Blog. Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review.